Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, Twitch is good. YouTube. Yep, sounds good to me.
Okay.
122. Yep, 122. Boom, and then we do Twitch and YouTube. Oh.
All right. You ready to get started?
Yep.
Hello and welcome to episode 122 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have a few upsets throughout the CDL to talk about, including two OpTic Texas losses. And we have a bunch of other matches as we gear up for the final week of online Call of Duty for this season. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. House of the Dragon returned tonight, so that was good. And now we got some good COD to talk about, so ready to jump right into it.
Yeah, so Friday, June 14th, we had quite a few really good matches. A little bit of surprises, definitely at least one, but we had history making in one match, and we had two game fives in another. The first, Minnesota versus New York, we both went with the subliners coming in, but the subliners have not been the most steady of teams this season, far from it. And Minnesota's, they've been known to, like they did last week, have a surprising performance, and they nearly pull off the upset here, but they end up losing a Game 5 round 11 to New York. What do you make of this? Obviously, it's we should mention accuracy stepping down from the team for at least for a little bit. I think he announced that his mother's cancer had returned, unfortunately, and obviously, best of wishes to accuracy and his family. That's obviously a really horrible situation that he's going through. What did you think of Spart coming in, and what did you make of his performance in Minnesota, really getting so close to pulling off the upset here?
Yeah, I mean that the first and foremost, that's the most important thing here is wishing accuracy and his family, good thoughts, positive vibes, all that stuff. Hope I don't remember when the situation really started for him because it feels. I mean, obviously it was when we were doing with the podcast because I know we talked about it, but um, you know, don't know all the details and whatnot, but seemingly his mom beat it once before, and has been putting up the fight that you want people in that situation to show. So tough situation, but obviously hoping the best for him and his family, and hopefully everything works out. But um, yeah, I mean this is a match you expect New York to win, even with Minnesota's full roster, and
Mm-hmm.
then they got an emergency substitute coming in. You really don't expect much out of Minnesota heading into that with an emergency sub, and literally the first map was probably the most lopsided map of the year, 250 to 38 hard point. That's not even a 100-point club. That's a 50-point club, right? But then Minnesota responds and they win the search and the control, and I'm like, oh geez, they got a shot here. And New York's able to win the second hard point, and then it comes down to another search, which Minnesota won obviously the game two. This one comes down to a game five, round 11, and New York just ices up and is able to get the win. But definitely, given the circumstances, a much closer match than probably a lot of people were expecting. In the situation that both teams are in terms of the standings and CDL points, it's being close to an upset isn't going to cut it at this point. But um, yeah, I mean it's obviously a round away from another major upset and some important points for Minnesota in their champs pursuits. But uh, yeah, New York was just able to clutch up.
And this is, obviously the situation is less than ideal, with everything with the roster and whatnot, but it's such a big week for Minnesota as it is for most of these teams. But Minnesota, they're in a spot where they have two incredibly tough games this week, and it's just that one round can essentially it could be the season if it comes down to that. Right now they're in a three-way tie for 8th place, and obviously we'll talk about it a little bit later in the show as we get through some of these other matches. But like that one round really is the difference between right now they're in a three-way tie for 8th. If they had won that, they would be in 7th. So that kind of makes a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. Obviously for New York, it's less meaningful because it's more about just building momentum for them. They have essentially locked up the 4th seed. I don't see them getting any higher or any lower at this point. But for Minnesota, obviously this is a big loss. And I thought it was, I don't know what the exact number is, but Standy, that his game one, he went 3-17. That has to be one of the lowest kill mounts in CDL history that isn't in S&D.
Oh, I thought it was funny because I don't remember where the tweet was and I didn't link it in the notes, but there's infamously the 4-23 game from Zuma at Champs and IW where he, claims there was lights on in his eyes on the stage and whatnot. Somebody said whatever Stanley went through, whatever you just said, 3-17 or whatnot, and mathematically that's a decimal point better, 0.001 better than 4-23. So it's Zuma still has the worst, statistical KD performance technically or something like that. But yeah, all things considered, that was a pretty lopsided map and obviously not a great performance. But I believe that I didn't put it down, but I at one point during the search I was Standy, the map 2 that Minnesota won, Standy had double or triple the kills that he had in that first hard point. I can't remember what he finished with. And
he had 10 kills in the first S&D, so he had more than triple his hard point kills, which is always good. But yeah, I thought Minnesota, obviously it's a huge loss. It feels like one of those Vegas Legion losses from late last season where it's just a little bit better and it could essentially turn the season around. It could make the season all worthwhile. But we also have the last week of qualifiers. We still have a major, so they can definitely turn that around. They can definitely essentially erase this kind of result and make it meaningless in the end. But it is, at this point, it is a big loss. Moving on, though, we have OpTic and Carolina. So we talked about it last week, OpTic losing to Minnesota, and how that's just a weird loss because Minnesota had been kind of drifting in the wind at that point. OpTic, of course, they won Major 3. They came into the Major 4 qualifiers with a very good chance to surpass Atlanta FaZe for that first seed in the CDL. I think they were only 10, 15 points behind, so they really were not that far behind. And if they had continued to do what they did in the Major 3 qualifiers and at Major 4, then they would be able to surpass FaZe. That's probably not going to happen at this point. I think it's still actually possible, but it's probably not realistic now. They lose to the Carolina Royal Ravens, which I mean, they almost pulled off the reverse sweep. This was not a great series from Clay. He even said so. I think he was pretty disappointed with some of his performance, but they end up winning. And they win a game five, which, I mean, Carolina, some of these bottom eight teams are very inconsistent when it comes to clutching up. But Carolina is able to do so here. They win both S&Ds. Of course, that is a trend that we've talked about. We've talked about the S&D game for Carolina this season. But I think the bigger story is probably OpTic to lose two matches now to, and we'll get to it later, but two matches to two of the worst or two of the most inconsistent teams in the league. Is that a big deal to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it's tough to how do I want to phrase
I
it?
should also mention that last season OpTic did this as well, because OpTic was very strong heading into the last set of qualifiers, and then they started sliding, or I think they might have actually started sliding at the last major, and then that turned into a poor champs performance. So this is back-to-back years where late season OpTic is starting to show weaknesses that they didn't necessarily do that earlier in the year.
I just feel, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about OpTic more when we get to today's matches too, but just in terms of this whole set of qualifiers, like it started out as they're obviously suffering some upsets and losses, but it seemed like they were testing out map pool, yada yada, all this. Now it's at the point where you can't really blame the map pools, and it's just like it feels like if they're losing to these teams, even if they are testing some maps, then maybe it's just time to stop testing maps if that's still what's going on. But you can't even really say that. I don't know. It's a really weird situation. It's just something you didn't expect to see from OpTic. At least I didn't. Um, in terms of this being what they're putting up online after winning a championship finally for the first time in, well, it was like 700 something days, 800 days,
Yeah,
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
Um, and the overarching, my literal, like, I wrote it down in the notes, my just immediate reaction to this loss in particular to Carolina was just something that I feel like I've said over and over on the podcast, is that you always want to be playing your best COD towards the end of the year, because that's when the most important tournament champs is. And whether OpTic has been testing maps, which seemed to be the case before, or regardless of what's going on in that camp, you just can't say right now that OpTic's playing their best COD at the end of the season, and that's got to be worrying for the Green Wall and their supporters. Um, so yeah, I mean, this is just, you know, we'll talk more about OpTic again, but this is a series here where they lose two S&Ds to a Carolina team that we've been talking about S&D with for a very long time now this season, and it's a 6-0 in the game two. That's just, you don't see that every day. So obviously a crucial win for Carolina in their champs pursuits, but this is just one for OpTic that you expected them, especially after what's happened in the weeks leading up to this week. If they were testing maps, as it seemed to be, regardless of what was being said behind closed doors and all that, it felt like, okay, this is the week. We got two matches this week. Whatever's happened before these qualifiers, we can put in the rearview mirror. We got to focus up, and now we got to make sure that we get our spot in winners bracket for Major Four, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, end of the day, it doesn't really matter what they do at Major Four because they're going to be a champs. But everybody knows OpTic guys want to be in the winners bracket at the Major. They don't want to start in the losers bracket, and they want to compete for a championship. And having a performance like they do this week, regardless of what's going on, testing maps and whatnot, that's just not going to help in that grand scheme of things in terms of, if they continue to struggle, it's just gonna, morale is gonna be down. The team's gonna start questioning each other. Maybe some chemistry issues or bickering between the boys and whatnot. Obviously, that's speculation, but it's just, you continue to lose, then only bad things can happen, really. Obviously, you can learn from your mistakes and you can learn from your losses, but That doesn't seem to be what's happened so far in these qualifiers. So I really don't know what to make of OpTic at this point. It's a very concerning situation for the Green Wall because, like I said, I've said it a bunch on this podcast. You want to be playing your best COD towards the end of the season, heading into champs, and OpTic isn't doing that right now.
Let's just loop in the OpTic New York match right now because like we could just have this conversation now and not wait
Okay.
until the end. Just essentially because both of these matches happened in a similar way. They both end up losing the a game 5, and now OpTic has lost 4 consecutive game 5s. They're the new Boston Breach.
Wow.
They have turned into a. I mean that's obviously not real, but before their losing streak, they had won 12 of their last 13. The only loss that they had, over like a 2 month span, essentially, or a month and a half, was that 3-1 loss to Toronto at Major 3. Other than that, they lost their very first Major 3 qualifier match to Atlanta, and then they won the remaining 6 in the qualifiers. They lose to Toronto in the winter semis of Major 3, and they end up winning the tournament, obviously, avenging that loss against Toronto in the grand finals, beating FaZe. Pretty much, we thought at the time, exercising all of the demons that they had kind of been building up for this season. And it started off well enough in these qualifiers. OpTic, they 3-0 Miami. We're thinking, okay, OpTic is on fire. They have essentially been, they've been scaling, as we like to say. They were waiting for their moment, and they were capitalizing on that moment right now. And then they lose to Vegas. They lose game 5. Okay, that's a weird result. We'll wait to see. The next weekend they lose game 5 to Minnesota. Okay, that's a pretty weird result as well. I don't really know what to do. And then they lose back-to-back game 5s this weekend to Carolina and New York. Of course, New York is a top 4 team. It is realistic. They have a very good roster, the Subliners do. That's a realistic loss. I could see New York beating OpTic. And they went to a game 5 with New York at Major 3, so that's not like a weird loss. But they losing to Carolina, Minnesota, and Vegas all in the same qualifiers, there's no way that's not concerning. And to lose game 5s like that, of course, it is kind of a coin flip in some of these situations, as we talked about with Boston. The fact that they had lost so many game 5s was, obviously not a good result, but at the same time, you try to be optimistic, think that, maybe you're just getting unlucky or whatever, but they shouldn't be in these situations to begin with these teams. And like you said, it doesn't matter that you're trying to expand your map pool or work out some of the kinks that you have in whatever maps that you want to play with at Major 4 and obviously at Champs. They shouldn't be in these situations, and they are. And I think there's going to be so much concern, I'm sure, about what these teams or there's going to be concern about OpTic, about if this team has it to win. Major 4 is kind of I don't want to say it's like pointless, because the momentum definitely means something, but like in the grand scheme of things, Champs is what they're building to. And right now, they just need to work out some of the issues that they're having, but they might only get one match at this point at Major 4. If things keep spiraling like this, that would obviously be worst case scenario, going in, starting in losers bracket at Major 4 and then getting bounced. But it's not super unrealistic. So I want to get your thoughts on OpTic right now, just in the full view of it now. 4 straight losses, all game 5s, and they have a very real possibility of starting Major 4 in the losers bracket and really finishing off the regular season as poorly as a championship contender can.
Yeah, I mean this obviously has massive implications for the rest of the teams too, just because um with OpTic potentially starting in the losers bracket, that is on paper a much tougher matchup than, say, Boston Breach or another team you would more likely expect to face in the first round of the loser bracket, not OpTic, who's a consensus top 4 team this year. Um, but that aside, just recently you mentioned the game fives to this weekend in particular. They went 0-4 in Search and Destroy, and obviously you're going to have losses in Search and Destroy if you're losing game fives. But 0-4 in Search, Allie was talking on the desk about just recent Search struggles. So 0-4 this week, plus the other game fives losses that you mentioned. If I had to guess, they don't have a great Search and Destroy record in these qualifiers, and that's something that's always a topic for us on the podcast. And if OpTic was dominating in the respawns, it probably wouldn't be as big of a deal and might not be as much of a topic of conversation. But if they can't win a game five right now, and that's causing them to lose these series, then that's the most obvious area to look at right now, is trying to fix Search and Destroy. What are we doing differently from when they played well at Major 3? Like what are we doing differently from when we were winning in the Major 2 and Major 3 qualifiers and all that stuff? Like they had the stretch where they literally didn't lose to anybody not named Atlanta FaZe for like 2-3 months or whatever it was. Now we're losing to Carolina and Minnesota and Vegas. Like it's not a great spot to be in for the Green Wall and those OpTic supporters. But I mean, yeah, that's got to be the silver lining in this right now, is that it's just you got your championship this year. They expect multiple and first at every event. We always say that. But in the grand scheme of things, even this upcoming Major 4 is an event with no fans, which is obviously one of OpTic's biggest strengths, is when they go to these events and they essentially have home field advantage. Obviously, it's shifted a little bit with the CDL era, with some of these city-based teams having decently strong local fan bases. But even to that extent, OpTic's still the most popular team and has the most fans. And a major event that's happening on LAN with no fans is something that you can say technically hurts. I don't think hurts is really the right word, but it doesn't help OpTic as much as it potentially would if it was just an event in any other location with fans in attendance. So at this point, I mean, we've seen teams with losing records make winners bracket before. OpTic's just gotta hit the ground running here this next week. Try and do what they can to get a winners bracket spot at Major 4. If they can't, then it's gonna be chaos in that losers bracket. And honestly, we'll talk about the standings later, but I know right now there's a 4-way tie for teams at 140 CDL points. Can you imagine just being in that situation where you're in a massive tie for CDL points with champs on qualification on the line, and one of the teams you're tied with gets to play Boston, and you have to go up against OpTic in the first round of the losers bracket? Like, that just has massive implications that these teams in this situation probably didn't see coming up, especially based on the way the brackets have really shaken out over these past couple majors.
Yeah, just in terms of seeding, like, it's going to be difficult for any of these champs teams to really prepare or to predict who they're actually going to play in that first round. Like, no matter if you're FaZe at 1 or if you're anywhere in the bottom, like, there's just no way at this point to actually know, because there's so many tiebreakers. As for OpTic, and the last thing I'll say on this is just like the bright side is they have, I guess, like a tune-up game essentially this week against Boston. Like, that is like, if you lose that, then what the hell are we doing? But like, if so I expect them to win that. I expect them to at least get some kind of momentum or some kind of a little bit of their footing, maybe find that again. But then they play Toronto, and that can obviously be a very difficult matchup for them. And then they have the major, and like you said, I definitely agree on that it might not be a disadvantage for OpTic, but they would have an advantage, or it is an advantage, that OpTic has so many fans. They have such a vocal fan base whenever they go to a major. Not to have that is kind of like, it sucks for them, I'm sure, or it's good for other teams at least. But they do have these last two qualifying matches. They do have Major Four, however many matches they have there before they get to champs. And I'm sure there is a lot of talk in that camp about what needs to be fixed. Obviously, the S&D is first and foremost 2-7 in the Major Four qualifiers in Search and Destroy, but that's not like an easy fix sometimes, especially because they're losing to teams that aren't necessarily super great. Like obviously FaZe, that was what slipped Atlanta up at Major 3. Was the S&D kind of fell out of they were in rhythm and it kind of fell out of rhythm at Major 3. If that's the case with OpTic, who knows how long that would take to get back in rhythm to work out the issues that they may be having. I'm just really surprised that I could see losing a match here or there. That happens all the time, especially online Call of Duty. But this is now over a 3-week span. They lost the first weekend, they lost to Vegas, then they lost their only match last week to Minnesota, and then 2 this weekend. That seems more indicative of an actual issue versus a fluke here or there. I don't know if you can really fluke 3 weeks, 4 matches in a row.
I mean, in the grand scheme of things, too, like the overall picture of the league now, like record-wise, OpTic is in third for CDL points at 415. Toronto's in second at 430. For match win-loss, we've talked about New York and their inconsistencies this year. They are 24-14 for a series count. Now, OpTic is 29-13. Obviously, OpTic's made it further in more tournaments than New York, so they played more matches. But that the series losses, New York has only lost one more series than OpTic this year now, and we've talked about New York on multiple occasions. The inconsistencies and them being like on the fringe of are they still a top 4? Even though I feel like for the most part we've agreed at least that we still consider them in our top 4. But that's at least been a conversation I feel like in the community and a talking point throughout New York's season so far this year. Now now OpTic, is in a position where they've lost one less series than a team like New York, who, you look at these standings again too. It's kind of weird to even say this, but it makes a lot of sense. So FaZe is 33-6 overall series count. Toronto 30-8. OpTic is 29-13, and New York is 24-14. Next is Miami at 15-19. So there are only 4 teams, the top 4, that are over 500 this year on the year, which is kind of, it kind of solidifies what we've been saying, but I haven't actually seen it in that context. And it really puts it into perspective. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a worrying sign for OpTic. But as much as we're talking about OpTic here, we can't discredit what Carolina and New York were able to do. Maybe not New York as much as Carolina is what I'm about to say. Obviously, it's an important win for both teams. But it was a very important win for Carolina because they're in that position to, they need as many points as they can get. New York isn't in that position. They want to win, but they don't necessarily need to worry about the points aspect of it.
Yeah.
But both teams played well in a match against a tough team who's the defending champ, regardless of what they've been doing so far. And New York in particular, in this series today, they really showed up in the control with a reverse sweep that kind of, they won the round 11 in the game 2 search, and then they went down 0-2 in the control and were able to reverse sweep that control to take a 2-1 series lead. If the round 11 goes the differently and OpTic is able to close out the control, we're talking about OpTic with a 3-0 here over a top 4 team, and that probably changes the whole narrative of our conversation tonight. So New York, Sib in particular, went on a massive streak in the 4th round, carried it into the 5th round, and then even there was the 4th map where New York was up 100 points on Rio Hardpoint, and New York or OpTic made a comeback to even force the game 5. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are some positives for OpTic that if you're looking for them, you can find them. But I do it's still worrying, and we're gonna have to see. I do think uh, if they end up losing to Boston this upcoming week, that's just like a massive red flag. I feel like we're throwing up red flags here, saying we're worried and concerned, but that would be almost like the final straw. It's like, okay, what the heck's going on here? Like they just that would be unacceptable in my eyes. Um, but yeah, as much as we're focusing on Optic, it was massive wins for Carolina and New York. They showed up when they had to and got the job done, and we're just gonna have to see where Optic goes from here.
I know this series isn't like the perfect example for this, but um, I think it's like really clear that if New York was like on the level of the top three, Toronto, Optic, and Atlanta, or somewhat close in the standings, I think it would be like Hydra's name would be in that MVP conversation, because like he's super valuable to this team. Like he played very poorly in the second hard point, the very close loss in Game 4. Obviously that could have cost them, but I think like his value to New York cannot be understated. He is incredible. But he's played like statistically, he is one of the best players in the league. But he obviously hasn't gotten the shine that he did last year, of course, because New York's performances as a team have not been up to par, or definitely. I mean, maybe that'll change if New York can end up winning Major Four, then things definitely could shift. He's not going to win MVP, I think, regardless of that. But like even then, that would make everything even more interesting if another team, a different team, could win Major Four, especially if it was New York. But yeah, I thought Hydra played decently well. I figured that this was a good time, as good of a time as any, to just mention that he is a very good player. If you guys didn't know, he's pretty decent at Call of Duty. But yeah, big win for New York. It's again, it's more like a momentum builder, maybe a confidence builder a little bit as well, because New York has struggled against those other top four teams. I mean, for Carolina, it's about as massive as you could possibly get. It's one of those wins that if they make champs, then they can look back on that and like, holy crap, how did we do that? That'll be a really pivotal victory for them at the end of the season if they're able to get there. And that is a big if, because the standings are a mess, but we'll get there. So let's go back. We'll settle down a little bit with a nice history-making performance by the Boston Breach. The final match on Friday was the Boston Breach, who were sporting they had tied for the longest series losing streak in CDL history last weekend. And we talked about it coming into this week. They played Atlanta FaZe in their first match of the week. Not the team that I would want to play if I was trying to break a losing streak. That's just me. And FaZe, they were not going to let Boston not make history. They were pushing the Breach into history. The Boston Breach now own by themselves the longest losing streak in Call of Duty League history. 14 at this point. We'll get there. 14 consecutive series losses. They're no longer losing game fives all the time. They've resorted to losing in more succinct, quicker ways. They lose 3-0 to FaZe. Not really any surprise here. But did a tear come to your eye watching the Boston Breach be, they've surpassed the Paris Legion for the longest losing streak in CDL history, which I thought would never be done. I thought that teams would just kind of get better and better. And, even if there was a losing streak, they wouldn't last over like multiple months. But the Boston Breach have surprised us all. So did a tear come to your eye when you watched this match?
Absolutely not. I have, been pretty vocal on the pod about thinking that the moves to replace Slasher and Asim probably weren't the best moves at the time. I forget exactly what we were saying. I feel like my thoughts at the time when it was possible for Boston to make moves was I was saying like I think Boston needs to make a move, but I'm not sure like who you make a move for and replacing it. Because I remember saying like you can't even really change Asim because you just brought him in, right? Well, I was wrong. But I guess you can take him out and then just proceed to not win a match for the rest of the year. So that's really where my head's at now, especially where they're at this historic losing streak. There's a real possibility they don't win a match the rest of the year. And then what happens next year, right? Like obviously Boston's gonna rebuild, but does the or the lose streak continue if the new Boston loses their first match of the 2025 season, or do we just like end the losing streak because that current roster is done competing, even though there's roster changes made with this roster, it's still this at least the same game and the majority